The colony ship Verdant Dawn carried 11,000 souls across the Veil corridor, and among them, the Scytherai delegation occupied Deck 7 with their soft luminescent scales and their precious cargo. 6 Vreth hatchlings, barely 3 cycles old, small enough to curl inside a cupped palm. The Scytherai called them catkin in the common tongue. Warm-blooded, purring, fragile as spun glass. Elder Kalen had overseen their care personally. The Vreth were not pets, not exactly. They were sacred companions, bonded to the Scytherai hive soul for generations beyond counting. When a Vreth chose a Scytherai elder, it was a spiritual event, a consecration. Kalen had raised these 6 from the egg sac himself, warm-breathed over each shell until they cracked open and blinked their golden eyes at him. He loved them the way oceans love their depths, quietly, completely, without needing to be told how. So when the hatchlings vanished on the 43rd rotation of the voyage, something inside Kalen cracked along a fault line he hadn't known existed. The search lasted 11 hours. Kalen and his second, Lyra, retraced every corridor, every maintenance passage, every climate-regulated garden pod on Deck 7. Lyra was younger than Kalen by 2 decades, but she moved through the crisis with a steadiness he envied, scanning beneath service panels, querying the ship's environmental sensors, interviewing every crew member who had passed through the sector. No thermal signatures in any of the auxiliary corridors, she reported, her voice careful and level. Environmental log shows Hatch 7C was briefly unsealed at the 22nd hour. Someone passed through. Who? Kalen asked. Lyra checked her data pad. The human. Kalen, the maintenance engineer. Orin. Kalen closed his eyes. The humans aboard Verdant Dawn were a small contingent, 12 crew members integrated with the Scytherai delegation for technical support. They were capable, generally well-meaning, and deeply, catastrophically unpredictable. Kalen had studied humanity for 30 years and still found them baffling. They laughed at pain. They ran toward danger. They formed inexplicable emotional bonds with creatures they had only just met. He had, in fact, specifically warned the human crew to maintain distance from the Vreth hatchlings. The young ones were still bonding. Exposure to unknown emotional signatures could disrupt the process. Now 6 hatchlings were missing, and a human had been near the hatch. Lyra's hand settled briefly on his arm, a Scytherai gesture of shared grief. "We should find him," she said quietly. They found him in Maintenance Bay 4. Kalen stopped in the doorway. Lyra walked 2 steps ahead of him, then stopped as well, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. The human, Orin, 26 years old, rated engineer class 2, with a work file that noted exceptional with crawl spaces and unconventional problem solving, was asleep on a narrow bench against the far wall. He was still in his work uniform, boots unlaced, one arm folded beneath his head as a pillow. All 6 Vreth hatchlings were asleep on his chest. They had arranged themselves with the instinctive architectural logic of creatures who understood warmth and proximity as survival. 2 were tucked against his neck, tiny faces pressed into the curve of his jaw. 2 more were stacked at his sternum, rising and falling with each slow breath. The remaining 2 had crawled beneath the fold of his open jacket and were visible only as small, breathing lumps against his ribs. Every single one of them was purring. The sound was soft and layered, 6 separate frequencies braiding together into something that resonated at the back of Kalen's throat like a cord held too long. He had heard Vreth purr before. He had heard it 1,000 times in 30 years of work, but he had never heard it like this. This deep, this unanimous, this settled. Lyra turned to look at him. Her expression was unreadable in the way that Scytherai faces became unreadable when they were feeling too many things at once. Scales cycling through pale gold, then a faint, wondering blue. "They chose him," she said. It wasn't a question. Kalen made himself walk forward, slowly, so as not to disturb anything. He crouched beside the bench and studied the scene with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades cataloging sacred moments. The hatchling's breathing was synchronized with the humans. Not close, synchronized, rising when he rose, settling when he settled. The smallest one, the run of the clutch whom Kalen had privately called Thread for the fine silver stripe along her spine, had tucked her nose directly beneath Orin's chin and had her tiny paw splayed flat against his throat, feeling his pulse. She was monitoring him. A 3-cycle Vreth, barely out of the egg, was monitoring a sleeping human's heartbeat with the focused instinct of a bonded companion 2 decades older. Kalen sat down on the floor. He wasn't sure when he decided to do it. His legs simply resolved the question without consulting him. Lyra found a crate and sat on it, and they both waited. Oren woke 40 minutes later with the slow surfacing of someone who had been deeply, completely unconscious. He blinked at the ceiling. Then he registered the weight on his chest, and his whole body went carefully, completely still. The stillness of someone who understood, on instinct, that sudden movement would be wrong. His eyes tracked down, found the hatchlings. His expression moved through several things very quickly: surprise, disbelief, a kind of helpless, overwhelmed softness. And then he looked up and found Kalen watching him. "Oh," Warren said. "Oh no. Elder Kalen, I can explain. I found them in the corridor near the garden pod. They were clustered near a heat vent, and I know you said not to touch them, but they were cold and they kept climbing onto my hands and I couldn't just." He stopped, swallowed. "I was going to bring them back. I sat down for just a minute and I must have. I'm sorry. I know this was wrong." Kalen looked at him for a long moment. "What did you do?" he asked. "When they first climbed onto you?" Oren blinked, confused by the question. "I just held still. Tried not to scare them. Talked to them a little, I think." Quietly. "What did you say?" The human's ears colored slightly, a distinctly human phenomenon that Kalen had always found interesting. "I told them they were okay, that they were safe, that I'd sit with them as long as they needed." A pause. "I know they don't understand standard, so it was more for me than them, probably." Kalen looked at Lyra. Lyra looked back at him with the expression of someone who was going to have a great many feelings about this later, in private, when she had time to process them correctly. "Oren," Kalen said, and the human went tense, bracing, clearly expecting a reprimand, or worse, a formal notation in his work file. The Vreth do not bond through speech. They bond through stillness, through warmth, through the specific quality of attention that says, "I am not afraid of you, and I will not leave." Oren said nothing. He was listening the way humans listened when they knew something important was being said, and they didn't want to miss it. 6 hatchlings, in 3 cycles of life, have never bonded simultaneously. Not to any single companion. Not in Sci-Fi record. Kalen gestured at his own chest. "What is happening on your chest right now has not happened before." A long silence. "Is that bad?" Oren asked carefully. "We believe they were lost," Lyra said, from her crate. Her voice was very even. "We had begun to grieve." Oren's face did something complicated. "I'm sorry. I didn't think. I should have sent a message. I wasn't thinking about how it would look from your side. I just didn't want to move them once they settled." "No," Kalen said. "You did exactly the right thing." He reached out and placed one careful hand beside Thread's small sleeping body. The hatchling didn't stir, but her purr deepened by a fraction, acknowledging, in the way of her kind, that Kalen was there, that he was known and safe. But she did not move toward him. She stayed where she was, tucked against the pulse in a human's throat, certain of her chosen warmth. "There will be documentation required," Kalen said. "A bonding record. Formal acknowledgement before the delegation council." He looked up at Oren. "You will need to be present. The Vreth will not go with anyone else for the ceremony. They will not understand why they are being asked to." Oren was quiet for a moment. "They're really bonded to me?" he asked. "Permanently. The Vreth do not make temporary decisions," Lyra said. And for the first time in 11 hours, there was something in her voice that was not grief or careful steadiness. It was, unmistakably, warmth. Oren looked back down at his chest, at 6 small bodies rising and falling with his breath, at Thread's tiny paw still pressed against his pulse as if keeping count. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay." He didn't move. Neither did any of them. The purring continued, 6 frequencies, braided together, filling the maintenance bay with a sound that felt, to anyone listening, like the universe briefly deciding that something had gone exactly right.